Thanks for joining us for our midweek study. We're continuing on through and finishing up chapter 15 of Matthew, and we're still dealing with Jesus as he goes into Gentile areas. As you recall that after dealing with the religious leaders and their intransigence about their traditions, he goes into the region of Tyre and Sidon, where he deals with the Canaanite woman and he sees her faith. He then heals many as he goes up the mountain in the area of Galilee, and again in the area that Jesus was traveling and the people who were following him. We can probably assume that many of those people were probably Gentiles that he was dealing with there. And then Jesus goes and he feeds the 4,000 in Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 32. So let's go ahead and start reading there. It says, "Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, 'I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and I have nothing to eat, and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way.' And the disciples said to him, 'Where are we going to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd?' And Jesus said to them, 'How many loaves do you have?' They said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up the 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan." Now, one of the things that might come to your mind if you've been following through with our study here is, well, why is Jesus feeding the 4,000 here? It wasn't too long ago that he fed the 5,000, and what's happening here? What's going on? Sometimes, when we hear these stories and they're similar, we think, well, these must be the same story. But that's not likely here for a number of reasons. The first being that some of the Gospels contain both the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. So it would be strange that the authors of the books confused one thing into 2 different things and confused themselves. Secondly, Jesus actually talks about the fact that there were these 2 feedings that are different numbers, and they had different things going on. So it's unlikely that Jesus kind of got confused by that too. So we have these 2 feedings. We have 5,000 and 4,000. The question is why? Why do we have these 2 things? And sometimes what happens is because we don't understand why these different stories are being put where they are, and we don't understand the function of these stories in the narrative, we think that the Gospels are just collections of kind of random Jesus stories. They are not. They are actually, there's a narrative form and structure here, and these are serving a narrative purpose. So when we look at this feeding of the 4,000, the question that we want to ask is, well, what's the narrative function here? And the narrative function is actually really important to what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, and that is that Jesus is experiencing this problems with the religious leaders of the Jewish people, and he has moved into an area that is much more oriented toward the Gentiles. In fact, what we see is that Tyre and Sidon, as you remember when he deals with the Canaanite woman, those were areas that were not Jewish areas. Those were areas that were Gentile areas. Now what's happened is Jesus has gone into this area that's known as the Decapolis, and that's where this second feeding is taking place. So the Decapolis, to understand this, the Decapolis, it's the 10 cities. So, you have the word deca, like, for instance, the decathlon. The decathlon is 10 events. Well, the Decapolis is 10 cities. There's an area here of 10 cities. And this is kind of an interesting thing because what's happened is that there's been people who have immigrated into an area that through a warfare and being taken into captivity and everything, what's happened is an area has been left kind of vacant, and a different people has moved in, and they've created these 10 cities. Now, what's happened is some Greek people have moved into these areas and created these 10 cities, and they're kind of autonomous. And in fact, they're so different from the Israelite areas, the Jewish areas, that Rome has them being administered differently. They're not under the Herods. The Herods are taking care of the Jewish areas, but these areas are so different that they're actually under different administration from Rome. They're culturally, linguistically, they're not associated really with the Israelites, even though they're Greek people who are very, very far away from where they should be geographically. So understanding this, what's happened here is that Jesus is going into this area, and he's going in there and he's doing a similar miracle to the one that he did with the Jewish people, but he's doing it with the Gentile people. And it's kind of important that he does this meal with both of them. The reason there's two is the first one with the 5,000 and the 12 basketfuls of leftovers and the 5 fish and 2 loaves, all that stuff, that has to do with the Jewish people. He's feeding the Jewish people. Here, what Jesus is doing is he's feeding the Gentile people. And what we'll see is that, number one, it's important that Jesus does both of these feedings. It's important that he does one with the Jews and one with the Gentiles, and the numbers of things become important as well. So let's go through this and understand it. So what's going on here? To understand this, we can go back to Mark chapter 5 and start reading that. Starting in verse 1 of Mark chapter 5, it says, "They came to the other side of the sea to the country of the Gerasenes." This is the same area, it's the Decapolis area. "And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me.' For he was saying to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' And he replied, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, 'Send us to the pigs, let us enter them.' So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea." So here's the thing. What we have to understand here is that when Jesus performs this miracle in Mark chapter 5 of taking the unclean spirits and casting them out of this man into the pigs, the reason that there's pigs there, remember the Jewish people don't eat pigs. The reason that there's pigs there is because we're in an area now that's a Gentile area. And so it's a completely different, culturally, all that kind of stuff. It's just different. And when Jesus goes into these areas, he's then dealing with Gentile people. Now, remember what happens to this guy who is then freed from these spirits is that Jesus actually, he wants to go with Jesus. He wants to be kind of one of the disciples or a follower of Jesus. And Jesus says, "No, you need to stay here, and you need to just tell all the people what you've experienced. All these people in the Decapolis area, you need to tell them what's happened to you." Jesus is basically kind of saying, no, your ministry is here with these Gentiles, because Jesus is going to go back to ministering to Jewish people. That's the main focus of his ministry. But it's important to understand that these things exist close to each other, and that, it's basically you cross a street and you're in a different town. Well, imagine that town was completely different. It's kind of like if you lived in the valley here a long time ago, there would be a point at which you'd cross into Guadalupe. And I remember the first time that I had went to Guadalupe when I was in high school, all the streets were dirt streets, and there were all the street signs were in Spanish, and I felt like I didn't know that area existed, and it was like I just left the United States really quick, and everything was so different. That's kind of the way that it is here, that there's this Gentile area that's tucked away in this place where it really is surprising to find it. So Jesus why does he go over here, and why does he do this feeding? Well, here's the thing that Jesus is actually going to create a church that combines Jewish people and Gentile people. That Gentile people are, remember that God, when he made the promises that he made to Abraham, he said, all the nations are going to be blessed through you. Well, it's important that God fulfills this promise, and the way that God is fulfilling this promise is that he's taking a church and he's creating it out of a Jewish root system and grafting on a Gentile bush, right? So he's making a graft that's both Jew and Gentile. He's grafting them together. And so Jesus is going to be feeding and providing life for not just the Jewish people, but the Gentile people as well. And so it's important that he does this miracle, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles as well. Now, when you look at the numbers here, some of them are kind of opaque and hard to figure out. And you see a number of different suggestions, and a lot of them I don't know yet. I don't know why the numbers line up the way they are. Why is it 5,000 for the Jewish people and 4,000 for the Gentiles? I don't know. But there are some suggestions that are made on some of these numbers. For instance, why 5 loaves and 2 fish? Well, some people believe that has to do with the Jewish people having the Pentateuch, the 5 basically books of the scriptures, the law that the Jewish people had. And so that seems logical to me as anything else. What about the baskets left over? Well, you have 12 basketfuls left over, and that's the 12 tribes of Israel. What about with the Gentile people? Well, it says, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7 and a few small fish. The understanding here is that 7 is the number of a week. It's the number of completion. And with the Gentiles' entry into the church, that there will be a completeness to the promise of God. And there's a possibility that that's the way that it is. It's a very difficult thing to figure out what some of these numbers represent here. The point, though, is an important one, that Jesus is here and he's ministering first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles, because this fulfills the Word of God. And so we thank you for joining us today, and we thank you for spending time studying with us this week. We hope to see you next week.